Sponsored by Brilliant.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Something doesn't make sense here. This solid rocket motor works, but it shouldn't. The fuel that's burning inside this thing creates gases that can reach up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but the tube that holds it together is made of aluminum, which melts at a fifth of that temperature. How is it possible that this thin aluminum, which should melt almost instantly, is able to hold it for a 9-second burn? And beyond that, how is it possible that the motor was only mildly warm to the touch a few minutes after firing? The answer is a thermal liner, a barrier in between the rocket propellant and the case wall. The liner keeps the hot gas from touching the case wall and is usually made of a composite material called phenolic. Phenolic, or more accurately, phenolic resin, is a nasty substance made by mixing phenol and formaldehyde. I don't want to overstate this, but these two substances are unbelievably bad for you. As is often the case, the worse a chemical is safety-wise, the better it works for rockets. I'm looking at you, Fluorine. Anyway, phenolic is used all over the aerospace industry because it's so good at managing heat. One place you'll find it is in heat shields for spacecraft. Hey, you want to go on a tangent with me? We'll talk about rocket motors in like a second, but come on, let's go on a tangent. Let's live a little. Let's talk about spacecraft heat shields. So the main goal of a heat shield is to keep the hot plasma that forms on re-entry from damaging or destroying the spacecraft. There are several ways to tackle this problem, and I'll address two of them now. One is ablative insulation, and the other is refractory insulation. We'll start with the second one. Refractory insulation usually looks like using lots of black tiles on the surfaces that see the most heating, and it's what got used on the Space Shuttle, X-37B, Dream Chaser, and now Starship. The insulation comes in several layers, and I will open up Onshape to give you a quick cross-section. The top layer must have an extremely high melting point. It must be able to survive the temperatures seen on re-entry, and according to this paper from the FAA, the shuttle surfaces on re-entry could reach up to 1500 C or 2700 F. The top layer is typically made out of borosilicate glass, among a few other things, and it has a melting temperature of around 1650 C or 3000 F, just beyond what the shuttle tiles saw for heating. The trick with refractory insulation is that the heat isn't so much dissipated as it is managed. The glass surface can get as hot as it wants, but we also need to hold on to that glass using a material that won't melt, and for that we use silica fibers. These fibers are very thin, on the order of several microns, and they're spaced far apart to create a very porous material, leading to a heat shield that is upwards of 90% air. In the case of the Space Shuttle, at the bottom of the tile, those fibers transition to a denser formulation, which then gets applied to a strain isolation pad, and then to the shuttle airframe, using 2 layers of RTV, or room temperature vulcanizing silicone. So when I say that the heat is managed but not dissipated, what I mean is that while some black body radiation occurs to remove heat or energy from those tiles, mostly the goal is to keep that heat physically separated from the airframe of the spacecraft using the air in between all of those silica fibers. Again, the surface can get as hot as it wants because we hold the surface far away from the spacecraft so we don't damage it. In an ideal world, this means that the heat shield can be reused for many flights, and that's why it was used on the Space Shuttle, which, for many reasons, was not quite as reusable as we had hoped. That said, another endeavor into full reusability is Starship. So let's take a slight tangent off of this tangent to talk about Starship. Last week's test flight, IFT-4, was the first time a Starship has made it all the way through re-entry, albeit with some damage along the way. Thanks to these live views on re-entry, we can learn something interesting about SpaceX's heat shield. On re-entry, we get these beautiful plasma flows, and as things get a little hotter, the color of that plasma changes. Now, we don't know all the details on the recipes SpaceX uses to create these heat shield tiles, but we can be reasonably sure it's not far off from what was used on the Space Shuttle. The changing color tells us 2 interesting things. Combined with the debris that begins coming off, the heat shield is likely transitioning from managing the heat to getting damaged by the heat. My granddad used to say that anything burns if it's hot enough, and these tiles are burnin'. Boron compounds burn green, and are most certainly found in borosilicate glass, which contains boron trioxide. If you are curious why the color of the plasma changes, that's why. The borosilicate glass on the heat shield tiles is burning off, which creates a green flame. Relatedly, this is the same reason you see a green flash at engine startup for liquid rockets. A mix of triethyl aluminum and triethyl borane is injected into the chamber to start combustion, and then trimethyl borate, a boron compound, causes that flash to be green. Did I add that part of the script because I wanted to say big words to sound smart? Yeah, of course I did. Let's get back on track. Let's say we're coming in too hot, and the entry heating will melt any type of refractory insulation. How do we prevent the spacecraft from getting damaged? Actually, the solution is to let the spacecraft get damaged, or rather, let the heat shield get damaged. This is referred to as ablation, which is where we slowly burn away the heat shield on re-entry. This is a complex process, and I've prepared a demo to show you how it works. First, let's talk about the material involved. We're back to phenolic now, the same material that I was talking about earlier as a thermal insulator for rocket motors. The phenolic resin is made of phenol and formaldehyde, and it's a liquid that can be infused into a flexible substrate like fiberglass, linen, canvas, carbon fiber, and others. This means that while the resin itself isn't a great choice as an ablative, we can take that resin, infuse it into a substrate material to make it stronger, and then cure it to form a hard block. You can then take that hard block, cut it to the shape you want, and use it in a heat shield to protect your spacecraft as it re-enters Earth's atmosphere. So what makes this material so good at what it does? I thought about making like a drawing or a sketched out cross-section for this, but then I remembered I have the material and I have a blowtorch. Let me just show you. This is a piece of linen phenolic that I cut out of the Simplex V1 rocket nozzle a year ago. I saved that scrap material and figured I'll probably never use this, and I can't describe the joy it gives me to know that today I will use it. After blasting the phenolic with a blowtorch for about a minute, I cut it in half on the bandsaw, and now we'll clean it up and check it out under a microscope. All right, we're at the workbench. I've got my digital microscope and the top-down camera with the phenolic rounds. Let's take a look at these things. Actually, before we get into the microscope, I do want to make a quick mention. The phenolic pieces have a little bit of grease on them, so there are parts or sections that look darker. These are not because the material has been affected so much as it's just like contaminated with grease. So not everything we look at here can be directly attributed to the ablation. Okay, microscope time. So starting out with the top layer here, this is the charring that happens. Now this char layer is made up of amorphous carbon for the most part. When the phenolic resin that's in this matrix, this linen phenolic matrix, when the resin and the linen burn off, they leave behind some deposits, and that's what this charring is. It's the carbon in there that does not burn, it just like sits on the top. And then the rest of the components of that phenolic resin off-gas, and they are part of the reason that this phenolic material is such a good insulator. They're not totally attributable for that though. It's actually kind of a shared duty, and we'll get into that in a second. Before we zoom in further, I want to talk about the bubbles in this material here and the little pops that you heard when I was hitting it with the gas torch. I think this has to do with the quality of the material. If I had to guess, the manufacturer probably got some air pockets with moisture or just water in there, or any type of gas or liquid that can expand when hit with heat. So if you have air pockets with a little bit of moisture or something that can expand a bunch, that's probably what's causing these little explosions in the material. And I think that's mostly due to the quality of the material. Also, the direction of that bubble coming out, you see the bubbles aren't coming out to the side or whatever. That also has to do, I think that is pretty consistent with like the layer direction here. And you can see smaller versions of it down here. There are just small little delaminations that happened because there's probably like a little air pocket that gets trapped in there. The second thing that I want to look at, and I'll take the other piece of material for this, is this phenolic section right here. So this is where the char layer comes off, and this is a good time to talk about how this char layer is weakly attached. And I don't mean it's attached every 7 days. I mean that this thing comes off with basically, if you look at it the wrong way. So I'll just tap it with my screwdriver and I can just remove it. It's extremely easy for me to remove this. This is a weakly attached char layer. So all of this char is mostly amorphous carbon, as I understand it. There's probably some other stuff in there, and it's possible I'm wrong. I'm fairly far out of my depth on this. But the amorphous carbon, as I understand it, is basically a jumbled up mess of these molecules instead of a nice crystalline structure like you would get with graphite. As a good reminder, graphite is just a form of carbon. Carbon fiber is another form of carbon. When they say it's a gem motor, graphite epoxy motor, right? The graphite is the carbon. Granted, there are lots of different grades. We're not going to get into the weeds on this. But this amorphous carbon is part of the reason that this is such a good insulation material, because when you form this layer, especially because of the structure of the carbon, there's a lot of empty space in there. So it makes a good insulator. Once again, kind of like the refractory insulation, we're using air as the insulator, and then we manage the heat with something that can take it. This carbon isn't going to melt. It will strip off. Again, it's weakly attached, right? But it protects the layer under it, and it does a pretty good job because I hit it with this torch for quite a while, and even like a little bit down below, all of this phenolic material is mostly fine. Okay, let's see if we can zoom in a little further. I love this. You should absolutely buy a digital microscope if you can. It's like totally worth the money. And I think it's like under $100 on Amazon too. Okay, what are we looking at here? There we go. So this is a very close-up shot of the phenolic material. This is right at the edge. You can see the edge of the material right there. And then you can see where the char layer forms. So this is an interesting specimen because it's not just the top layer, but any part that's getting hit with heat is going to start charring. Now, another word for this is pyrolysis. It pyrolyzes, and that's just giving off the gas, leaving behind that carbon and a couple other things. Again, if I'm wrong on this, let me know. I mean, be nice about it, but like let me know in the comments. I could be wrong. And then you can see the untouched resin below here. So there's the char layer that's got all of that amorphous carbon. It's got all of the, there's a bunch of air in that section at this point, and that protects the layer that's below it. I'm just gonna poke around here for a little while. There's so much interesting detail that we can see here on this char layer and otherwise. Like if I move around over here, yeah, there we go, look at that. So this is a beautiful like interface between the char and the actual phenolic resin. So anything that looks tan or brown, that's the untouched resin or the unburnt resin. And then anything that's black or darker brown, that's when it's starting to pyrolyze and burn. And then all of these little fibers, these are part of the linen. This is part of the linen mixture, the linen substrate that's holding it together better than just the resin would. Like resin, anyone who works with resin or epoxy or two-part glues knows that on its own, the tensile strength is not great. So we have to include some type of substrate to give it better material properties. And that's what the linen in this mixture is doing. You don't just have to use linen though, and I think I mentioned this before, but you can use canvas, you can use fiberglass. SpaceX infuses a bunch of this phenolic resin into a carbon fiber structure. I think it's called fiberform. Here's another interesting shot. This is a top-down look between the char layer and the untouched layer. Again, the char layer just easily comes right off. I bet I can get more to come off if I just do this. Yeah, there it goes. I think I heard it splash in the other side of the room. But the char layer is weakly attached, and I think we should probably have a conversation about this in the next few videos about simplex, where we're going to talk about mass flux and how important mass flux is to ablation, because that makes, in my opinion, a much bigger difference than the actual heat that the material is subjected to. So we'll get to that. If you're itching to hear about it, don't worry. I also want to take a look at the other side of the phenolic here, which is untouched by the flame, but gives you a better sense of that linen substrate, that linen substructure. And it's interesting to compare, it's interesting to see this is truly just a composite structure. So this is the bottom of the linen phenolic right here. This is untouched by the flame. Both sides are untouched by the flame. This side is the side that got cut with the horizontal bandsaw, and this side is just pure, what it looks like when it came from the factory. And you can tell that this is truly just a composite material because this side is extremely smooth, and that phenolic resin is the main ingredient on the top. I don't feel any of that linen substrate, because you can imagine when you lay up a composite material like this, you usually use a little bit more resin than you do the substrate. And that's good for us here because the phenolic is the thing that creates most of that char. But the bottom surface is smooth, just like if you were doing a carbon fiber or fiberglass layup and you had a little bit extra epoxy that floated to the surface or that came to the bottom. It's quite pretty to look up close at this linen substrate. It's clearly got a basically 0 to 90 degree weave in it. And the linen is pretty thick, which is worth noting. You know, this is not quite what we'd see for a structural composite. But again, as I said earlier, like, I'm not buying the top shelf material. We don't really need a lot of structural integrity in this material. We just need that phenolic resin. One thing that's also probably worth mentioning in this process is the safety when working with this stuff. So as I said earlier, it's phenol and formaldehyde that you combine to make this phenolic resin. And that in its form, in its like liquid form, is really bad for you. It's not good. Don't mess with it. Most people aren't making their own phenolic composites. It's more of an industrial process. But once it's in this solidified and hardened form, it's not as bad to work with. If I'm just holding this here, my main concern actually isn't the phenolic at all, it's that char. I don't want to create a bunch of dust and then breathe it in. But where you do start to get concerned again is when you're working with the material on a machine. So if you're cutting pieces off, you're going to create some of that dust, whether it's fiberglass dust, carbon dust, you know, any type of composite dust when you're machining it or cutting it, that stuff cannot be breathed in. So you've got to wear a respirator for that process. This is a bit of a spoiler, but this is the Simplex V2 rocket nozzle. I took cross sections of lots of the Simplex V2 parts. And I think I'm gonna do a video where I just do a top-down and microscope explainer of the whole cross-section. So I'm gonna save that for a little bit later, but we are gonna talk a lot more about phenolic ablation in that video and how that process works between just the heat soak and the mass flux and the liner itself. There's a whole lot to talk about, and I think I'm gonna save that for one of the next few videos. So back to the other version of me. All right, hello again. So that is a look at a very generic piece of phenolic. For heat shields, we can get more specialized with it though. Phenolic composites like this are dense, which means they're very heavy. For anything that flies on a rocket, the goal is almost always to keep it as lightweight as possible, which is why in the 80s, NASA developed a composite material called Pika. The name stands for phenolic impregnated carbon ablator, and a spin-off of this material called Pika X is the SpaceX version that gets used on the Dragon capsules. We can actually find out a decent amount about both of these materials, much of it coming from this one research paper that I found on a website that looks like it's the official SpaceX website, but is actually a Polish news site about SpaceX. Anyway, Pika and Pika X are extremely similar materials, and their fundamental differences largely come down to the manufacturing process. The process begins with a carbon fiber substrate, and much like the refractory insulation from earlier on Starship and the Space Shuttle, these carbon fibers are very far apart and very porous. The fibers are then coated in phenolic resin, which will eventually pyrolyze and form a char layer that protects the spacecraft on re-entry. I couldn't find the substrate carbon fiber material used by NASA when Pika was developed, but the major innovation from SpaceX, which led to a 10x cost reduction, was switching to a similar fiber material called Fiberform. I went down quite the rabbit hole while trying to find out more about Fiberform, which was developed by a company called Fiber Materials Inc., who no longer has a website. Of course, that is no match for me because I have the Wayback Machine. When I look back at the website in 2021, I can't find a whole lot of detail. In fact, I see nothing about Fiberform, but we do see that FMI likes extreme materials. They also make these extreme materials for some intense programs. These are things like Standard Missile, the Patriot Missile, THAAD, and the Trident D5 submarine-launched nuclear ballistic missile. We talked a bit about ITAR in the last video, and if it's not obvious, if we can't find a lot of detail about this material, I won't be that surprised. But if we go further back to 2017 on the Wayback Machine, we can find the same page with info about Fiberform. This is a material meant for furnace insulation, used as a substrate for a spacecraft heat shield. It doesn't stop there though. I went way back to 2003 to poke around this very old-looking website, and I found this. Tons of detail. We've got density, we've got compressive strength, we've got thermal conductivity, porosity. In all likelihood, these are probably details that you could get with a quick inquiry as a customer, but it was cool to find that the further back I went, the more companies were willing to publish online. So that is quite a lot of information about phenolic and heat shields, and I almost forgot we were supposed to be talking about phenolic liners for rocket motors. I showed this motor at the beginning and said that it shouldn't work, and the reason it does is a phenolic liner. Actually, that's not quite true. This was the biggest challenge in terms of propulsion development for the Space Shot rocket. I mixed my own custom liner from bare ingredients and injected it into the case, then spun the assembly above 1,000 RPM to cast that liner directly into the motor. We just went through a whole video on phenolic insulation, and you know what's crazy? I don't use any phenolic in that liner. We're able to achieve good results while staying away from bad chemicals. In the long run, this spin casting approach will save me time, money, and complexity, and in the next video, I'll explain how this whole process works. Even though I'm not using phenolic in the thermal liner that we're going to talk about, the reason I made this video is not just because I like going on tangents and talking about heat shields, although that's certainly part of it. It's that understanding the charring and pyrolysis behavior that phenolic goes through is an important step in understanding why the next steps we take for the thermal liner are important. You can think of this video as a sort of precursor to the next one. It'll be important context. That said, before we get to the next video, I would like to thank the sponsor for this video. Oh hey, I didn't see you there. I was just spending 15 minutes a day getting smarter. What's that? You want to learn how you can do it? Well, you can use today's sponsor, Brilliant. You are not going to be able to see that. The sun is way too bright. Brilliant has become a longtime sponsor of this channel, and it's because I love what they do. It's an interactive platform built around the idea of learning by doing. The most effective way to break new ground in your own learning journey is by putting the new concepts you learn into practice. It's by working through problems in real time that you get a much deeper understanding. Brilliant focuses on courses in math, science, engineering, data science, and many other fields, and you get to play around with the fundamentals in these areas because every lesson is interactive. If you've got a subject you want to learn or something you don't understand, Brilliant probably has it covered because they've got thousands of different exercises to choose from. You might think to yourself, well, there's no way I have time for all that. I'm too busy. Are you though? Are you totally sure? Because you can do full courses through Brilliant in as little as 15 minutes a day. I don't think you're too busy for that. If you want to give Brilliant a try, you can do that for free for the first 30 days by going to brilliant.org/BPS.space or clicking the link in the description. And the first 200 people to do that will additionally get 20% off an annual premium subscription to Brilliant. Thank you so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you for watching. My name is Joe. May your skies be blue and your winds be low.